Imagine you are 33 years old. You run a small investment firm out of your apartment. You have just gone on national television and told the country that the American economy is heading for a depression. You have testified before Congress. You have bet your clients' money and your own on that conviction. And then the market does the exact opposite. Stocks begin the greatest bull run in modern history. You are not slightly wrong. You are catastrophically, publicly, humiliatingly wrong. You lose so much money that you have to let every single employee go, one by one, until the company is just you again. And then you have to drive to your father's house and borrow $4,000 so your family can pay the bills. Most people would call that the end of a story. Ray Dalio calls it the beginning of his. That collapse in 1982 is the hinge on which the entire book, Principles, turns. Because Dalio did not respond to being wrong by becoming more careful or more humble in the ordinary sense, or by quietly leaving the business. He responded by asking a strange and almost mechanical question: what would I have to change about the way I think in order to never be blindsided like that again? And the answer he arrived at was not a better forecast. It was a system. A set of written rules for encountering reality, tested against outcomes, refined over decades, eventually numbering in the hundreds and filling a 600-page book that became one of the most divisive business books of its generation. Today, I want to walk through that book with you. Not as a fan and not as a skeptic, but as someone genuinely curious about what happens when a person decides to treat their own mind as a machine that can be debugged. Some of what Dalio found is genuinely useful and hard to argue with. Some of it is stranger and more contested than the book's admirers usually admit. Both parts are worth your time. Ray Dalio published Principles, Life and Work in 2017 through Simon & Schuster. By then, he was one of the most successful investors alive. He had founded Bridgewater Associates in 1975 out of a two-bedroom apartment in New York City, and over the following 4 decades built it into the largest hedge fund in the world, managing well over $100 billion at its peak. The book arrived at a specific moment in his life. He was in his late 60s, stepping back from day-to-day control of the firm and explicitly trying to convert what was in his head into something that could outlive him. His origin story is more ordinary than you would expect. He grew up on Long Island, the son of a jazz musician. He was, by his own account, a bad student who hated memorizing things other people had decided he should know. At 12, he was caddying at a golf club, carrying bags for Wall Street men who talked about the market while they played. He took his caddying money and bought shares in an airline. His entire investment thesis was that the stock traded below $5 a share, so he could buy more shares of it, so he would make more money if it went up. That is not a strategy. It is a 12-year-old's arithmetic. The company happened to be acquired, and he roughly tripled his money, and he was hooked, he admits, on a completely wrong idea that happened to work. He went to college, then to Harvard Business School. He traded commodities on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. He worked briefly at established Wall Street firms and did not fit in anywhere. One of those jobs ended after he punched his boss. And then he started Bridgewater, at first as a small advisory shop writing research for corporate clients about currency and interest rate risk. So by the time of the 1982 catastrophe, he had already spent years being right often enough to become confident. That is what made the fall so instructive. He had not been careless. He had done the analysis. Mexico had in fact defaulted on its debt. The logic was sound. And reality did something else anyway. The lesson he drew, and it is one of the lines from the book that has genuinely entered the language, is that a person who lives by the crystal ball is destined to eat ground glass. He decided that the goal could not be to predict correctly more often. The goal had to be to build a way of operating that survived being wrong. And that meant hunting down the smartest people he could find who disagreed with him, and stress-testing his thinking against them, rather than hunting for people who would confirm it. The book is organized in 3 parts, and it is worth knowing this because most people only read one of them. Part 1 is a memoir, where he came from, told chronologically. Part 2 is Life Principles, his general framework for how to encounter reality as a human being. Part 3 is Work Principles, which is essentially the operating manual for Bridgewater, and which is by far the longest and most controversial section. The principles themselves are numbered and nested, hierarchical, sometimes crisp and sometimes maddeningly abstract. He also released a shorter illustrated version, Principles for Success, and later applied the same method to macroeconomic history in Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order. One more piece of context, because it matters for how you read him. Dalio has practiced transcendental meditation since he was a young man, since around 1969, and he credits it directly for his ability to stay calm and see his own reactions from a distance. The whole book is, in a sense, a technology for stepping outside yourself. Meditation is where he first learned that was possible. The first life principle is the foundation for everything else, and it is deceptively simple. Embrace reality and deal with it. What Dalio means is more aggressive than it sounds. He is not saying be realistic in the deflating, lower your expectations sense. He is saying that reality is a machine that operates according to cause and effect, that it does not care about your preferences, and that your only real leverage is understanding how it actually works rather than how you wish it worked. He calls his own stance hyperrealism. And the striking claim he attaches to it is that hyperrealism is not the enemy of ambition, it is the only reliable engine of ambition. Dreamers who refuse to look at reality fail. Realists without dreams achieve nothing worth achieving. The people who change things are what he calls shapers, practical dreamers, people who hold an enormous vision and simultaneously refuse to lie to themselves about a single detail of the path there. He puts Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, and Elon Musk in this category. The most common failure mode, in his telling, is confusing what you wish were true with what is actually true. He returns to this constantly. Your brain is not a neutral instrument. It is an advocate, and the client it represents is your self-image. He grounds this in nature, which is where the book gets either profound or slightly odd depending on your taste. Dalio looks at evolution and takes from it a set of uncomfortable conclusions. Nature optimizes for the whole, not for the individual. Evolution is the single greatest force in the universe, and it works through a relentless cycle of trying, failing, and adapting. Pain is not a malfunction in that system. Pain is the signal that produces adaptation. A muscle grows because you strain it. A species advances because members of it die. He extends this to a claim that people find genuinely hard to swallow, that you should stop asking whether something is fair to you and start asking whether it works. Nature does not have a fairness module. And so his advice is to look at whatever is happening to you not through the lens of, do I deserve this? But through the lens of, what is this teaching me about how the machine operates? There is a passage in the book where he talks about looking down on your own life from above, seeing yourself as one small ant in a much larger colony, and finding that perspective liberating rather than diminishing. He writes that you are simultaneously everything and nothing, and you get to decide what you want to be. It is, oddly, one of the most spiritual moments in a book otherwise obsessed with process diagrams. If you remember one formula from this book, it will probably be this one. Pain plus reflection equals progress. The claim is not that pain is good. The claim is that pain is information and that almost everyone wastes it. Something goes badly. You feel awful. And the instinct, the overwhelming human instinct, is to make the awful feeling stop as quickly as possible, by blaming someone, by explaining it away, by deciding it was bad luck, by simply not thinking about it. Every one of those moves converts a costly lesson into nothing. Dalio's move is to insert a deliberate gap. When you feel the pain, do not act on it and do not flee it. Reflect on it. Ask what it is telling you about a mistake in your thinking. And here is the practical part that most readers underrate. Write down the answer as a principle so that the next time you encounter that class of situation, you are not relying on your memory of the pain, which will have faded, but on a rule you wrote while the pain was fresh. That is literally where the book came from. Every principle in it is a scar with a sentence attached. At Bridgewater, this became institutional. They keep an issue log, a running record of mistakes, which employees are expected to enter themselves. The story behind it is worth telling. A trader named Ross forgot to place a trade. The money just sat there in cash. It cost the firm a meaningful amount, and by any conventional Wall Street logic, he should have been fired on the spot. Dalio's reasoning went the other way. Firing him would teach the organization to hide errors. Instead, they built a system that made surfacing errors normal, and Ross helped build it. The principle Dalio drew is that the pain of a mistake is a one-time cost, but the lesson from it is a permanent asset, provided you actually extract it. He goes further, into territory that makes people uncomfortable. Mistakes, he argues, should not merely be tolerated. In a healthy organization, an environment where nobody is making mistakes is not a sign of excellence. It is a sign that nobody is attempting anything at the edge of their ability, or that people are covering up. The thing you punish is not the error. The thing you punish is the concealment of the error and the failure to learn from it twice. There is a real tension here that the book acknowledges and never fully resolves. Extracting the lesson from pain requires you to look directly at evidence that you are stupid. And the entire architecture of the human ego exists to prevent exactly that. Which brings us to the barriers. Dalio identifies two forces that keep intelligent people stuck, and I think this is the most genuinely useful diagnostic in the book. The first is the ego barrier. Deep in your brain, underneath the part of you that reasons, there are older structures that experience being wrong as an attack. When someone tells you your idea is flawed, some part of you does not hear a proposition being evaluated. It hears a threat. That is why disagreements escalate so fast, why smart people defend indefensible positions, and why the phrase, "I might be wrong," is so much harder to say than it should be. Dalio describes it as two yous living in the same skull, a higher level you that can reason, and a lower level you that reacts, and the entire game is teaching the higher one to supervise the lower one. The second is the blind spot barrier, and it is subtler. Different people literally cannot see certain things. Not, will not, cannot. Some minds see big picture patterns and are blind to detail. Some see detail beautifully and cannot assemble it into a picture. Some are wired to see risk everywhere, others to see opportunity everywhere. This is not a matter of effort or virtue. It is closer to color blindness. And the trap is that you cannot perceive your own blind spot by definition, because the thing you are missing is precisely the thing you cannot perceive. Put those together, and you get his conclusion. If your ego makes you defensive and your wiring makes you blind, then your own judgment alone is structurally insufficient. The only escape is other people, specifically, thoughtful people who see differently than you and are willing to tell you so. He calls the discipline for this radical open-mindedness, and he is careful to distinguish it from being agreeable or wishy-washy. Radical open-mindedness is not abandoning your view. It is genuinely believing you might not see the best possible answer and treating the disagreement itself as the most valuable thing in the room. He offers a practical test that I find useful. Notice whether you are asking questions or making statements. If you are arguing, you have already lost the ability to learn from this conversation. If you are asking what the other person sees that you do not, you are still in the game. He also draws a distinction between open-mindedness and open-endedness. The goal is not to stay in doubt forever. It is thoughtful disagreement, which means a focused, time-bounded stress test between people who disagree, with the explicit aim of getting to the truth rather than winning. And then a decision. This is the concept Bridgewater is famous for, and the one that generates the most heat. Dalio's proposition is that most organizations make decisions in one of two bad ways. Either they are autocracies, where the boss decides and everyone else performs agreement, which means the organization can never be smarter than one person. Or they are democracies, where every opinion counts equally, which sounds fair but is actually absurd, because on any given technical question the opinions in the room are not equally informed. His alternative he calls an idea meritocracy, and he defines it with a formula: radical truth plus radical transparency plus believability-weighted decision-making. Radical truth means saying what you actually think, to the person's face, rather than the polite version in the meeting and the honest version in the hallway afterward. Dalio is scathing about that gap. He considers talking behind someone's back a serious offense, worse, in some ways, than saying something harsh to their face, because it corrupts the information flowing through the organization. Radical transparency means the information is not filtered. At Bridgewater, this took a famous and literal form. Nearly every meeting was recorded, and the recordings were made available to employees, including meetings where Dalio himself was criticized. His logic is that if people can see the actual reasoning behind decisions, they stop inventing conspiratorial explanations, and they learn from watching real thinking instead of hearing sanitized summaries. Believability weighting is the part people miss. Dalio is not saying all opinions count equally. He is saying opinions should be weighted by track record. A believable person on a given question is someone who has successfully done that specific thing repeatedly, his rough benchmark is at least 3 times, and who can explain the cause and effect behind their success rather than just pointing at the outcome. If you have never done the thing, your opinion on the thing is a question, not an assertion. Say it is a question. The tool that made this concrete is the dot collector. It is an app where, during a meeting, people rate each other in real time on dozens of attributes. Was that reasoning sound? Was that person being open-minded? Were they assertive without listening? The dots accumulate over years into what they call baseball cards, a profile of each person, showing statistically what they are good at, what they are not, and how much weight their view should carry in any given domain. Dalio showed this on a TED stage in 2017, including footage of a young employee rating Dalio's own performance in a meeting poorly, to his face, on the record. The ambition behind it is almost science-fictional. Dalio's dream, pursued at Bridgewater through a project sometimes called PRIOS, was to encode his decision-making principles into algorithms, to build a machine that could make management decisions the way his investment algorithms make market decisions. Because that is exactly what he had already done on the investment side. His trading process is not intuition, it is decades of written criteria, converted into code, back-tested against historical data. The book's most radical suggestion is that you could do the same thing to management and eventually to your own life. And I should note one of his most important investment ideas, which sits inside this section of his thinking. He calls diversification the holy grail of investing, and he means something mathematically specific. If you can find 15 or 20 genuinely uncorrelated sources of return, you can cut your risk dramatically, by something like 80%. Without giving up expected return. It is the closest thing to a free lunch in finance. And notice that it is the same idea as believability weighting, just applied to assets instead of opinions. Do not bet everything on one view. Assemble many independent views and let them offset each other's errors. One of the least glamorous, but most practically useful sections of the book is the insistence that people's minds are not variations on a standard model. Dalio leans heavily on personality assessment, Myers-Briggs, workplace inventories, various instruments, not because he thinks any one test is gospel, but because he thinks the alternative is worse. The alternative is assuming everyone is basically like you, and then being perpetually baffled and annoyed when they are not. His claim is that the single biggest mistake most people make is failing to see themselves and others objectively. Not failing to be nice. Failing to be accurate. If you hire a person wired for detail into a role that requires synthesizing ambiguity, you have not hired a bad employee. You have made a design error, and then you will punish them for it, and both of you will suffer. This is where the phrase, "the who is more important than the what" comes from. Before you debate what to do, get right who is deciding. A brilliant strategy assigned to someone whose wiring is wrong for it will fail, and you will spend months debugging the strategy when the strategy was never the problem. He also talks about the shape of a life, and here he borrows Joseph Campbell's hero's journey framing. Dalio describes 3 phases. In the first, you are dependent on others and you are learning. In the second, others depend on you and you are working and you are trying to succeed. In the third, others no longer depend on you, and your task shifts from succeeding yourself to helping others succeed without you. The book itself is an artifact of that third phase. He is explicitly trying to hand over the machine. And the parenting metaphor he uses for management is worth pausing on, because it explains a lot about Bridgewater's reputation. He describes tough love, and he compares it to a lion teaching its cubs. The roughness is not cruelty, it is preparation. Whether that metaphor holds up depends a great deal on whether you are the lion or the cub. The organizing metaphor of the work principles section is that you are not a worker inside your organization. You are a designer standing above it, looking down at a machine, comparing what it produces against what you wanted it to produce. That gap between outcome and goal is your only real feedback. And your job is to keep asking whether the gap comes from a flaw in the design or a flaw in the people slotted into the design. Almost every management problem in his framing reduces to one of those two. The engine that runs inside this machine is what he calls the 5-step process, and it applies at every scale, to a company, to a project, to your own life. Step 1, have clear goals. Not many goals. Prioritized ones. He is blunt that you can have almost anything you want, but you cannot have everything, and refusing to choose is itself a choice with worse odds. Step 2, identify problems and do not tolerate them. Note that these are two separate acts. Seeing problems requires attention. Not tolerating them requires courage, because most problems in most organizations are visible to everyone and inconvenient for someone. He says that tolerating a problem has the same effect as not seeing it at all. Step 3, diagnose problems to get at their root causes. This is where he thinks almost everyone fails. The temptation is to jump straight from "this is broken" to "here is my fix," which produces a solution to the symptom and guarantees a recurrence. Real diagnosis is uncomfortable because root causes are usually attributes of people, including you, rather than events. Step 4, design plans that get around the problems. Design deliberately, like an architect. Play the movie forward in your head. Write the specific tasks and who does them. Step 5, push through to results. Do the tasks. He notes that these 5 steps require completely different talents, and that almost nobody is good at all 5. Which is not a tragedy, it is an argument for teams. Find the people whose wiring covers your gaps, and be honest enough to admit which steps you are bad at. There is an important asymmetry buried in step 3 that I want to underline. Diagnosis before design. It sounds obvious when stated. In practice, watch any meeting you attend this month and count how many minutes are spent establishing what actually caused the problem versus proposing what to do about it. In most rooms, the ratio is close to 0. I would be doing you a disservice if I presented this book only on its own terms, because Principles is genuinely contested and the criticisms are not trivial. The first is about the culture itself. Bridgewater's environment is famously brutal for many people. Turnover has historically been very high. A large share of new hires leave within the first couple of years. Journalists who have covered the firm have described the experience of being publicly rated, recorded, and dissected as closer to psychological ordeal than education. The generous reading is that this is a filter and that the people who stay genuinely flourish. The critical reading is that a system which most people cannot survive is not a system that works, it is a system that selects. The second criticism is sharper, and it goes to whether the principles were actually applied to their author. Reporting on Bridgewater, most prominently in Rob Copeland's 2023 book, The Fund, alleges that in practice the idea meritocracy had an exception at the top, that dissent from Dalio was risky, that the leavability scores tended to track proximity to Dalio, and that the transparency ran in one direction more than the other. Dalio has disputed that account. But it is worth sitting with the structural question underneath it, because it is a genuinely hard problem. Can a system designed to make the founder's judgment challengeable survive the founder's own ego, when the founder is also the one who wrote the rules and controls who stays? The third criticism is about transferability. Bridgewater is an investment firm, and investing is unusual. You get a numerical score on your judgment, repeatedly, from an indifferent market. That makes believability measurable in a way it simply is not in most professions. How do you compute believability for a novelist, a nurse, a schoolteacher? The feedback is slow, noisy, and contested, which means the most rigorous-looking part of the system may be the least portable. And the fourth, gentler criticism is about the book itself. 600 pages, hundreds of numbered rules, many of which read as unimpeachable and unmemorable. Be radically open-minded. Don't tolerate problems. As a reference manual, it is impressive. As something a human being can actually run, it may be too much. The best use of this book is probably not to adopt Dalio's principles. It is to steal his method for generating your own. Let me pull the load-bearing pieces together. Reality does not adjust to your preferences, and the most expensive thing you can do is confuse what you want to be true with what is true. Hyperrealism is not pessimism. It is the only foundation ambitious plans can stand on. Pain is information, and almost everyone throws it away. The formula is pain plus reflection equals progress, and the operative word is reflection, the deliberate pause between the hurt and the reaction, in which you write down what the hurt just taught you. Your judgment alone is structurally insufficient because the ego barrier makes you defensive and the blind spot barrier makes you unable to see what you cannot see. The only fix is thoughtful disagreement with people wired differently from you. Notice whether you are asking or arguing. Opinions are not equal, but neither is the boss automatically right. Believability weighting is the middle path. Weight views by demonstrated track record in that specific domain, and when you lack one, phrase your view as a question. Almost every problem is either a design flaw or a people flaw, and you will not know which until you diagnose the root cause instead of leaping to a fix. Diagnosis before design. Every time. The who matters more than the what. People are wired differently. That wiring is largely not a choice, and matching people to roles accurately is a form of kindness disguised as cold analysis. And the meta lesson, the one that outlasts every specific rule in the book: write your principles down. Not because Dalios are right, but because the act of converting a painful experience into an explicit, testable rule is what turns a life of random events into an accumulating body of knowledge. Most people learn the same lesson 6 times because they never wrote it down the first 5. Here is what I keep coming back to about principles. The reason the book is 600 pages long is also the reason it is worth reading, and it is not the content. It is the demonstration. Ray Dalio is showing you a man who got destroyed by reality at 33, and who responded not with resilience in the vague inspirational sense, but with a peculiar kind of engineering discipline. Treating his own mind as a system that produced a defective output and refusing to move on until he had traced the defect to its source and written a rule that would catch it next time. You may find his culture repellent. You may think the recorded meetings and the real-time ratings are a solution to a problem you do not have, or a cure worse than the disease. That is a defensible position, and the reporting on Bridgewater gives it real weight. You may also think the man who wrote a system for holding power accountable did not always submit to it himself, which, if true, would be the most human thing in the entire book. But notice that you can reject all of that and still be left with something. Because the core move is not radical transparency, and it is not the dot collector. The core move is this: the next time something goes badly for you, and your whole body wants to explain it away or blame someone or simply stop thinking about it, you pause. You ask what this is telling you about how the world actually works, as opposed to how you assumed it worked. And you write down one sentence you can use again. Do that 100 times over 20 years, and you will have your own book. It will not look like Dalio's, and it should not. But it will be the thing he actually got right, that a life spent colliding with reality is either a series of unrelated bruises or an education, and the only difference between the two is whether you bothered to take notes.